Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Senators, I rise to speak today at third reading on Bill C-45 to deal with an angle of the legalization of cannabis that is very worrisome, and that is the use of tax havens to finance these products. The government's legislation is aimed in part at getting organized crime out of the picture. But is that realistic? We heard from a number of experts that organized crime is organized and very imaginative and creative when it comes to countering any action by the police. It is not that we shouldn't try to stop organized crime, but we need to be organized as well and realistic. According to Statistics Canada, $6.2 billion of cannabis was sold on the black market in 2017, and this is a huge market. And so those who are benefiting will certainly not sit back and let this market be taken away. In the United States, a recent study by the Smart Foundation just a few weeks ago shows that what the Justice Department has said is not correct. In fact, organized crime is not going away. In Colorado, which legalized cannabis in 2012, and in other states, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and Washington, D.C., all these areas have found that that organized crime has continued to dominate the black market. Over 7,000 pounds were confiscated in Colorado. There have been hundreds of deliveries stopped, hundreds of arrests. There has also been an effect of postal deliveries of cannabis, and there have been huge amounts of cannabis confiscated in rural areas. This was a 44-page study that was overseen and vetted by Boston Children's Hospital, by Harvard University, and by the University of Colorado, among other organizations. Nick Niporatos, an expert, has said that we have conducted a lot of research on legalization of cannabis, and we see that Colorado now has the highest volume of black market sales and other problems. Oregon legalized cannabis in 2014, and 60% of sales are on the black market since that time. In all of the states, therefore, where legalization was carried out, the black market is thriving. So this is an example of how organized crime adapts very well. One way they do this is to penetrate the legal market and launder its funds. We were told that we had nothing to worry about. Over half of the product that will be sold in Quebec through the provincial sales outlets will come from large producers, and there will be a monopoly by the SAQ in this area. So 33,000 of the 60,000 tons of the cannabis that will be sold in Quebec come from these tax havens, Apothecary and other companies bring their funds in this way. The Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, Barbados, Aruba, Curacao, Malta, Marshall Islands, Seychelles Islands, Luxembourg. There don't seem to be places that are too remote or too underpopulated to be used as bases for these companies. 40% of these companies have received offshore funding over the past 2 years. So if we do want to fight organized crime, we have to prevent money coming in through these tax havens or through money laundering. At least we have to make sure that the companies producing cannabis are clearly transparent and that their stockholders are as well. We heard through the committee Marwa Rizki, who is a tax professor at the University of Sherbrooke, and she told us that it will not be possible to figure out who actually owns these companies. If there are 10 companies, one owns the other, and so on. So it's a hierarchy, and sometimes it is a trust that is at the top. We don't know who really owns the license. If the situation is similar to medicinal marijuana, then there are going to be huge holes. We don't have the names of the shareholders in these companies. So I move that the bill be not now read a third time, but that it be amended as follows by, in clause 62, replacing line 17 with the following: directly or indirectly, and any other information to be made available to the public by the minister under section 121.1, and B, on page 78 by adding the following after line 9. 128.1, the minister must make available to the public the name of every holder of a license or permit, including, if the holder is an organization, the names of A, its directors, officers, and members, and any person who controls it directly or indirectly. B, any parent corporation or trust that controls it directly or indirectly. C, the directors, officers, and members of, and any person who controls its parent corporation directly or indirectly. D, the shareholders of the organization or parent corporation, or in the case of an organization or a parent corporation that is a public corporation as defined in paragraph A of the definition public corporation in subsection 89(1) of the Income Tax Act, the shareholders of the organization or parent corporation that hold more than 5% of any class of shares, and E, the directors, officers, and beneficiaries of any trust that controls it directly or indirectly. So by making sure that there is complete transparency, full disclosure about the corporation or trusts that hold control, and then we will know who is behind these corporations and make sure that they are not associated with organized crime, that are doing indirectly what they cannot do directly. I would therefore ask you to support this amendment. Thank you.
It is moved in amendment by the Honourable Senator Carignan, seconded by the Honourable Senator Andrzejczak, that Bill C-45 be not now read a third time, but that it be amended. Dispense. On debate. Senator Pratt, is there time for a question? Question? The time for Senator Calignan's time has expired.
On debate? Senator Royale on debate?
Yeah. Honorable Senators, I want to bring to your attention the concern that has been raised at Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee in relation to the issue that has been mentioned by Senator Carignan in relation to the protection of the market, of the licit and legal market of cannabis from organized crime. You will remember, of course, that two objectives of the government, two policy objectives of the government. One is to promote health among Canadians, and especially youth. And the second is to exclude organized crime that control, according to the testimony that we heard at the committee, more than 50% of the market of cannabis in Canada. But what we have heard, which is of greater concern, is the fact that the medical or therapeutic cannabis market has already been invaded by organized crime. So in other words, the cannabis that you can buy in a store that is essentially making you available the cannabis that the doctor has prescribed to you, even that cannabis that you buy legally, licitly on the street is infected by organized crime. It's not me who states it. It's the president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, Mr. Mario Harel, who testified in front of our committee on March 22nd to 18. And I want to read to you what Chief Harel has stated. Quote, "We also ask the federal government to enact strict security clearance requirements that would safeguard against criminal organization becoming licensed growers, as has been observed in the medical marijuana regime." I repeat, becoming licensed growers, as has been observed in the medical marijuana regime. The Canadian Police Association remains concerned with the inclusion of organized criminals as licensed grower distributors in the cannabis regime, since organized crime has infiltrated the medical marijuana industry. This is a major problem in our view. So that's what the president of the Association of the Chief of Police has stated to us 2 months ago. And then I want to quote also from Superintendent Yves Goupil from the RCMP, who is the Federal Police Criminal Operation Director. And here is what Mr. Goupil stated, Officer Goupil. "Yes, there are organized crime groups that will certainly use tax havens or even so-called beneficial ownership, where they are hiding behind corporate secrecy to invest and get licenses to produce cannabis," end of quote. So in other words, à la fois the RCMP and the various police groups in Canada are aware that the market is already in the licit market of therapeutic cannabis is already infected by organized crime, and that there is serious ground to be concerned that the new market that's going to be open for the general consumption of cannabis will also be infiltrated by organized crime. In an article that was published in January of this year, the Journal de Montréal has given a list of 38 companies, that 35 companies out of the 86 producers who have been authorized to produce cannabis. Those 35 companies, and I have the list here, and I'm going to give them to you so that you have an idea of how much money has been invested from those hidden funds in fiscal paradise in the various Canadian companies. Abcan Global, Cayman Island, 12 million. Aurora Cannabis, Cayman Island, 32 million. Kentrust Holding, Channel Island, Bahamas Island, 549,000. Supreme Cannabis Corporation, 130,000 from Bahamas. And there are 5 other invested also in those companies. I'm giving just the major one. Cannabis Wheaton Income Corporation, Cayman Island, 20 millions. Hydropothecary, that was mentioned in the Senate yesterday, Cayman Island, 15 million. Bahamas, 751 million. Delshan Therapeutics, 3 million. Kronos Group, and I continue, Honorable Senator. Kronos Group, $225,000. New Strike Resources, 70,000 from Singapore. Emblem Cannabis, $8 million among 7 fiscal paradise that have invested in that company. Golden Leaf Bahamas, 5 million from Cayman Island. Invictus, from the Seychelles Islands, 765,000. American Group, 9 millions. The Green Organic Dutchman from Barbados, 100,000. From Bermuda, 115,000. From Cayman Island, 500,000. From Emirates, from Dominican Republic, from Luxembourg, from Switzerland, from Curacao, from Aruba, from Panama, from Malta, from Virgin Islands, from Belize, from Marshall Islands. If you want to have all the amount of money are listed with those names. Harvest One Cannabis, 600,000 from Luxembourg, and 4 other fiscal paradise in that company. WebMD, Cayman Island, 2 million. Delta 9 Biotech, 300,000, and so on, Honorable Senators. From Cayman Island, more than 250 millions have been invested in Canadian companies who have received permit. So this is not an imagined or fabricated story. Those are the real figures. So when I heard Mr. Chief Officer Harel, on behalf of the Chief of Police Association, asking us, and I quote, "We ask the federal government to enact strict security clearance requirements that would safeguard against criminal organization becoming licensed grower, as has been observed in the medical marijuana regime." End of quote. I really paid attention to that because the facts are quite clear. The half, at least, of the companies that have received a permit have received millions, hundreds of millions of dollars from fiscal paradise invested from peoples or funds we don't know the identity at all. Nobody knows the identity unless we accept the proposals, the amendments proposed by Senator Carignan, that the identity will be made public, and it will be for any Canadians to look into the registry and know the identity of who is selling the product and who's benefiting from the profit of it and who is reinvesting or sending the profit outside Canada and avoid being taxed. Because one of the key features of the regime that the government proposed is to make sure that the benefits are shared with the provinces at 75%, with the Aboriginal people receiving part of it, so that everybody will be in a position to assume the additional social cost that the regime will, of course, trigger once it is implemented. So if we allow that almost half of the company who will get the permit are able to shift the benefit out of the country and pay minimum taxes, 1 or 2% of taxes, it means that the overall aggregate of money available to share with the provinces will be diminished by as much. So it seems to me that there is an element of public good to have the capacity, as is proposed in the amendment of Senator Carignan, to know who are those peoples who benefit from the regime. There's nothing, secret about this. If we are to establish a regime that will fight organized crime to leave the market, to promote legal cannabis, I think it should be legal from top down. Not only from the persons who go to the store to buy and pay over the counter, but from all those who will shift the profit somewhere else. So it seems to me that we have to give a lot of credit and weight to those testimonies that we have heard from the RCMP and from the Association of Chiefs of Police to know the identity. We were told that knowing the identity is the key factor to control the illicit production of cannabis. So, honorable senators, I support.
Senator, but your time has expired.
Senator Woe.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm thinking out loud here, having just heard this amendment today. I wish we had received it earlier so we could have spent more time thinking through the intended and unintended consequences of the amendment. There's a lot of appeal to it, I have to say, and in the next few minutes I'm just going to ramble a bit about some of the questions going through my head. There are at least 4 different things that are going on here in this amendment, and both Senators Carignan and Senator Joel have touched on these disparate issues, some of which are intimately connected, all of which overlap, but all 4 of which are not the same thing and which really need some careful distinction. The first issue, of course, is the existence of tax havens, or let's call them low-tax regimes, which, for many of us is a problem because there's a race to the bottom and there's a loss of tax revenue, so-called tax gap problems, which deprive Canada and other higher tax regimes of the revenue that they would otherwise have received. But that is a much bigger problem that obviously goes beyond cannabis industries and the funding of Canadian industry. There are, I'm sure you all know, many other types of industry in this country that draw funds from tax havens, from low tax regimes. Whatever views we have on it, that is a generic issue that goes beyond cannabis, and we should not conflate all of the problems that we see in tax havens with this particular bill. The second issue, connected but not entirely the same as tax havens, is the question of beneficial ownership. Of course, many tax havens are in place not just because of low tax regimes, but because they hide the identities of the beneficial owners. And Senator Whetstone, I know, will be telling us about an inquiry that he has now put on the floor and will be discussing soon. And the issue of beneficial ownership, again, is very intuitively appealed because transparency is good. More transparency is better than less transparency. But I think we all recognize that knowing who are the beneficial owners doesn't get to the question of whether or not the beneficial owners are problematic or not. We will still have a challenge of identifying whether or not the beneficial owners are good guys or bad guys. And the simple idea that I think may be put out in this chamber that beneficial ownership identity will make everything clear about criminal networks using their proceeds to fund licit cannabis industry. I think that's a little naive, and we should not, and it may still be a good idea. This may still be a good idea, but we should not pretend in any way that understanding beneficial ownership will solve the problem of spotting the so-called bad guys. The third issue, again, connected but not perhaps in the way that some of us are thinking, is the fact that there may already, from testimony, apparently there already is money from criminal organizations in the medical marijuana market, and if the bill goes through, that there will be money from criminal networks in the licit cannabis market. We need to think hard about what this really means. The fact that there's criminal money in the licit market doesn't make the licit market illicit. I think we have to be really clear in understanding that. It doesn't It doesn't change the fact that when we've legalized the cannabis industry, the money that has gone into it from sources that we don't know somehow makes that industry any less legal. Now, the fact that it came from a criminal network would suggest that they are doing criminal activities, the people from whom this money originated. These folks are doing criminal activities in other industries that are still illicit. You can imagine prostitution, trafficking of other illicit drugs, and so on. And that's where we should be paying our attention. How can society, our law enforcement agencies, target the ongoing illicit activities of criminal organizations who are continuing to work in those industries? That, to my mind, it's a slightly tangential issue, but I know it's a concern that all of us share. But it will not be addressed by this amendment. That's a different problem. That's criminality by networks doing criminal things in illicit industries that have nothing to do with the legalization of the cannabis industry. So I put that out as the third issue that we need to sort out in our own heads. And, well, that really sums up my point that as we consider this amendment, and I haven't made up my mind on it, I'm really, as I say, speaking on the fly. I wish we had more time to think about this amendment and to weigh all of the testimony and all of the views and maybe ask views of other experts on it. I am concerned about unintended consequences. But one thing I am sure, a lot of what has been discussed already this afternoon around this amendment, some of it is very, very germane to the bill. Some of it is really about other problems we see in our tax regime and in the way international capital works. Some of it has to do with our distaste of criminal networks, but this amendment will not necessarily solve all of those problems, so I encourage all of us to think very carefully as we prepare for the vote.
Question, Senator Swingett?
Senator, answer a question. I understand the intent of this amendment, and I'm not in disagreement, but I don't think it will achieve what we want to achieve. Like, even though Senator Joyal has stated a slate of companies or enterprises or investing firms, I don't know them. I don't know their background. I don't know if they are a criminal element or not. So if it's public, I don't even know what they're all about. I don't think it will give me or any Canadians the tools to achieve what we want to achieve, removing the criminal element. So in your perspective, wouldn't it be not better to achieve what we'd like to see achieve, to have a strong recommendation that the minister responsible provide all these details to our law enforcement agency and seek the origin of these funds and make correction if correction needs to be done to remove criminal elements?
Senator Wu.
Thank you, Senator Shunga, for the question. I do agree that certainly when we come up for the review, the 2 3-year reviews and a 5-year review by the joint chambers, that should be a key question that we put to the government to provide information on. I also agree with your characterization of this beneficial ownership transparency not really answering the question we want to answer. Senator Joel gave us a very impressive long list of tax havens and the amounts of money that are coming from them. Of course, we cannot presume that these are criminal networks. I mean, we may not like the fact that rich people are hiding behind these structures, these, special purpose vehicles in places far away that we have never been to but dream of going to perhaps, and that they are able to deploy money into our industries at will. But reciting a long list of companies and monies coming from the Caymans and the Bahamas and from Luxembourg and from goodness knows where else, is not tantamount to a list of criminal networks investing in our industry. And it would be very, very unfortunate if this chamber were to give that impression, because tax havens, whether we like it or not, they exist, people use them, and it's part of a funding structure. I'm not defending tax havens. Perhaps, and I know we will have another debate soon about tax havens. We will have a debate about beneficial ownership. We need all of that. I'm not sure that trying to tackle those problems in the guise of or in the form or through the mechanism of a cannabis bill is the best way to deal with that problem.
Senator Platt, voulez-vous prendre la parole?
Senator Plett, would you like to speak? You are the next after Senator Dow.
Like others, I didn't intend to speak on this, but having just seen the amendment, I must admit that I'm quite impressed by it. The problem, of course, is we do not know if the list Senator Joel read out from well-known tax havens are criminal elements or not, and that is the very purpose of the amendment, transparency and openness. The fact we don't know hinders our law enforcement agencies, hinders our international tax treaty, hinders the Canadian Revenue Agency. We do not know. We had before the Senate Banking Committee, John Allen of Transparency International, who is one of many groups who are simply trying to get Canada to catch up to what many other countries have done for many years in advancing the information of who owns what. He indicated at that meeting a line that struck with me, that you have to disclose more information to get a library card in Toronto than you do to open a corporation and hide the owners. So imagine that. We have agencies of law enforcement, revenue collection, who are trying to track down taxes that are owed in this country, and they don't know who owns the company. They're hidden behind walls that we cannot penetrate. Our country is massively behind other countries. The European Union in the last few months and years have made tremendous advances in this area. Even if we simply copied what they did, we would be light years ahead of from where we are now. On this amendment in particular, we have the transparency we need, we have the information we need, we have all the financial information we'll need, so the law enforcement agencies and others can know if these are criminal activities or not. They will then have, if this amendment passes, the information they require to determine what we all want to know. Are these legitimate businesses? Are these businesses controlled by criminal organizations? That's what we want. The second part, of course, is, I believe as Senator Joel mentioned it as well, is the actual collection of the revenue. As we all know, it's not illegal to have an account outside Canada. It is, however, illegal not to declare the proceeds from those accounts. So we will may end up with a situation where we end up currently in Canada, where a host of individuals and corporations, rather than them paying the money owed in Canada, move the money offshore and avoid paying taxes. The Conference Board of Canada, a very well-respected think tank, last year published a report indicating the tax gap, the difference between what the government is collecting and what they should be collecting, could be up to $48 billion. They do not know the amount, we don't know the amount, and more importantly, the Revenue Agency does not know the amount because of this lack of transparency on beneficial ownership and who owns what. We're now being asked to approve companies in this very important area that we're voting on. Billions of dollars seem to be at stake when you look at the value of these companies, and we don't know where the money's going. Who's behind it? The fact that they're from well-known tax havens, in my opinion, is highly suspicious, but is not proof. This information will give our officials the information they need to do the job that we all want them to do. We don't want criminal organizations coming in the back door when we wouldn't let them in the front door, which is a major part of the bill to remove the criminal element from marijuana sales, and distribution in Canada. So I congratulate the mover of the amendment, and I'll be supporting it.
Senator, question? Question, Senator Wu? Senator Down, you take a question? Senator Wu?
And you've worked on this issue much longer than I have, and I know you know the subject much more intimately. I think, would I be right in asserting that you would like to see beneficial ownership information and clarity on the tax gap across the entire Canadian economy rather than just for one industry, because presumably the use of tax havens and the use of obscure structures to hide beneficial ownership extends well beyond the cannabis industry?
Down.
Well, absolutely. The problem, of course, is that the Canadian government, for whatever reason, and it's a mystery, but they refuse to adopt the rules that other countries are moving to quickly. There's no indication that they're prepared to move in the short or long term. There's groups meeting, there's discussions being held, federal provincial meetings being convened. But the problem is, it's not a matter of reinventing the wheel, it's simply looking at what they're doing in other countries, what is adaptable to Canada to correct this problem. There's, as I said, again, it's a mystery to me. I've looked at these files extensively over the years, and the Canadian government has every excuse possible. On the tax cap, for example, it's been, I won't repeat, but everybody knows there's a host of countries around the world that do it. Most of the G8 countries, OECD countries, Turkey, Switzerland, UK, the list goes on, even the state of California, plus the American government, been doing it for years for a host of reasons, good financial planning reasons to help their countries collect the revenue that is required to run their health care, their education, and all the infrastructures we take for granted when people pay their fair share of taxes. But the Canadian government resisted that from the day one. It took the parliamentary budget officer threatening to take them to court. We had meetings 3 or 4 years ago where they had a legal opinion, he had a legal opinion. They only reluctantly agreed to provide him with the information to measure the tax gap after he threatened to take them to court, and then they coughed it up. I say that simply as an illustration of the government. You know, the Stanley Cup playoffs are on now, so ragging the puck, if you will, not taking any initiative, not giving any leadership on this file whatsoever, and at the expense of Canadians. You know, think of what we could do if the conference board, if they're right in their figures that the tax gap could be up to $48 billion, think of what that would mean for Canada. We would have no deficit. We would have opportunity to lower taxes, fund additional programs. Even if half the money was collected, the country would be in far better shape. And the thing that always annoyed me more than any others, colleagues, was that people complain about taxes, but we all understand the collective good of paying taxes. We have a healthcare system that is outstanding. There are complaints over and over, but you look around the world, who would not want our healthcare system? We have an educational system. We have infrastructure. Our problems are compared to the rest of the world, minor. But it takes a lot of money to keep the social harmony going. It keeps a lot of money to keep the infrastructure in place. And the people who avoid paying taxes in Canada, I always ask the question, if they or a member of their family becomes ill, do you think they're taking the health care in Panama or Bahamas? Or are they returning to Canada to take advantage of our health care system, but they don't want to pay the taxes to pay for that? Is that any way fair? And Senator Durrell, again, hit the point of how much revenue will we lose if these companies, who we don't know who owns them, we don't know who's behind them, if they use all the tricks in the book to avoid taxes, as companies and individuals have done in the past. Our revenue agency and our law enforcement don't have the tools to go after them because they don't know who's behind them. what would the cost to the nation be? And secondly, the equally valid point, we're trying to keep the criminal element out of marijuana distribution, and we don't know if they're actually in it or not. So this amendment will actually be very good for a host of other areas in the Canadian economy as well. But since we're dealing with this bill today, it suits the purpose of what we have before us, which is transparency, openness, let the sun shine in, if you will, where there's no information available about who these people are from the Caymans, who these people are from other tax havens. It struck me when I read the list a few months ago what countries these people are from. It's a massive collection of tax havens. It's highly suspicious, but again, we have no proof. This will help us find out what is really going on. It may be as innocent as the day is long. It may not be. Let's find out. Thank you.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you. Very briefly, I find myself in the same situation as Senator Wu. I just haven't made my mind up, and I'm just thinking out loud. But just to add a few points, things I'm thinking about, I'm wondering whether similar regimes exist for other companies, or whether we would be requiring of these companies, which are legal companies and producing legal products, whether we're requiring of them information that we're requiring from other companies that also would be receiving investments that go through tax havens, because tax havens, as Senator Wu has stated, exist and have existed for a long time. Whether we're requiring the same from tobacco companies or firearms companies or oil companies or alcohol companies, and if not, what would be the reason why we would be requiring from legal companies producing a legal product so much information? I'm also looking at what exists in the bill right now for companies that would ask for a license to produce cannabis products. One of the many requirements that they would have to send to the minister financial information in respect of an organization requiring a permit would include information about its shareholders or members and who controls it directly or indirectly. And also an amendment that was adopted by the Social Affairs Committee gives the minister, because in the regulations it's already provided that the minister can ask for a security clearance for anyone playing a major role in the company, but also with the amendment brought in by the Social Affairs Committee, the minister may specify by name or position any person who must hold a security clearance if the minister is of the opinion that the person performs, has performed, or is about to perform activities related to a license or permit. In other words, the minister can require a security clearance for practically anyone who plays any role in the company. So there are already safeguards. Whether that is sufficient or not, that's something we have to think about, I think, in thinking about this amendment. But the main point is, we have to really ask ourselves whether it is necessary to ask of those companies something that is not required from other legal companies who may also be receiving investments from tax havens and other provenances. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Senator Dean, as you said, you were thinking out loud, or Senator, and I hope that your mind is not made up. What Senator Carignan is proposing, and what has been supported by others, is what was proposed by experts in the committee. So this is different from other industries because we are decriminalizing a whole sector. Right now, organized crime is completely in control of the industry. The federal government wants to decriminalize it, and It seems from what we have been hearing that organized crime is using the back door to retain control of the cannabis sector. We're being told that we can wait and see, but in fact, the problem is right now. We can't say, don't worry, we'll look at this later. I think we need to document the situation right now. The problem is here and now. 40% of the companies who have received a license in Quebec are being funded through tax havens. That's almost half. And worse yet, the journalists who have been doing investigations have called all of those corporations, and all of them have refused to comment. So I think that sets off a bit of an alarm, because why would they refuse to speak? It seems that organized crime through illegal money is active, and we know that it was through illegal sales of drugs that these groups got the money to put in the tax havens. So are we going to have that same money recycled and invested in this new legal industry? We have to think about it. If we don't have transparency, well, in 3 or 4 or 5 years, it will be too late to look into it. Organized crime will have regained control over this sector. The police are saying that 30% or more of the marijuana that will be sold will be funded by organized crime. So if you don't create greater transparency, one of the objectives will not be met, and that is to counter organized crime. And of course, organized crime will be selling to minors. We have to make sure that the sector is financed with greatest transparency.
Colleagues have made some very compelling reasons for this particular amendment. The list of possibilities in terms of tax havens is something we've talked about here, and we all want action taken on it. I don't think there's any doubt about that whatsoever. Difficulty with a motion like this, it gets presented at the last minute, and I think as Senator Wu said, what are the unintended consequences of it? I wanted to ask a question of either Senator Joyal or Senator Carignan, but they ran through their 10 minutes of time, so I didn't get an opportunity to do that. I want to know, for example, this is not done generally with other corporations. That is the making of it publicly. I can understand the government getting this information. The government should get every bit of this information, should be able to flesh out the tax havens or flesh out the illicit operators. No doubt about that. But we don't make that all that kind of information on other corporations public, either private corporations or publicly traded corporations. Are there some privacy concerns? What are the unintended consequences of it? Now, we were obviously interested in this issue when it was at Social Affairs Committee, so we asked the questions of the government with respect to it. Mr. Blair, the point person on this, said, I'd like to draw your attention to one thing. This bill will require organizations that acquire and maintain licenses for the production and processing of cannabis submitted to be enhanced financial transparency. Health Canada can obtain the records of these financial transactions and the investments. It is built right into the bill. In fact, there is a requirement that the license holder, the name of the license holder will in fact be made public. But all of this additional information, yes, the government should have it, but should it be made public? What are the consequences of all of that? I just raised that because I certainly agree with the endeavor to get these kind of people using illicit funds out of any kind of license position on cannabis production. But I think we need to have a better understanding of the consequences of all of this. I might add one other thing. Senator Carignan, and of course that's because of his position, will paint the bleak picture of what's happening in Colorado or other parts of the United States, and we'll draw on the witnesses that back up the information. But there are other witnesses with the other side of the coin who have a very different kind of view of all of this. There's one aspect, for example, in Colorado, where there has been some increase in organized crime, but it's people coming from out of state that are then sending shipments back into the state that they're from, because there's no border controls between the different states. You can easily do that. Whereas in Canada, you'd be subject to criminal penalty if you tried to export it outside the country. So that there are, and a lot of the other statistics I think are refuted by very notable figures in the government and people that have been involved in the academic community analysis of what is happening in Colorado and other places. So I don't buy all of that. But certainly, tax havens, yes, we want them out. Is this the means to do it? I don't know. We really should be taking more time to consider these kind of things. That's why I wanted these resolutions all put at committee. This resolution wasn't put at committee. Instead, it's being put here for the first time, and it puts people in an awkward position to try to understand what are the unintended consequences.
Are senators ready? Senator Dean?
Very briefly, I think we're talking a lot about additional things that we could do, and as Senator Eggleton points out, not pausing perhaps quite enough. So look at the requirements, rigid as they are, that are already present in the licensing requirement for cannabis companies. The licensed companies are rigorously screened. All key personnel and all officers, directors at each company must undergo security screening and be granted a clearance prior to a license being issued. Under the new regulatory framework, individuals in key positions to direct or control a licensed business, such as directors of a parent company, and site owners would also be required to hold valid security clearance. And these provisions, unlike the discussion we're having today, have been tested by the drafters for charter compliance and privacy compliance, which presumably we haven't had the ability to do here. So we don't want to run into something and find that we're out of compliance with privacy laws afterwards, do we? I'd also point out that there's a focus on, I think, securities law here. These companies are not immune to the disclosure requirements and financial security requirements of other companies in Canada. They're not getting a free pass. They're already regulated in exactly the same way as other companies. And that includes that public companies required under the income tax to report where shareholders own more than 10% of shares must be disclosed. That's not as tight as the 5% that's mentioned in the motion, but it's pretty rigid. So I'm reminding us here that we've learned from other jurisdictions. We've rested on current compliance laws and income tax and disclosure laws. And the government has put in place a rigorous security testing and compliance regime that frankly is not required, I believe, of many of the hundreds, if not thousands, of other companies in other businesses that receive investments from some of the tax havens that have been mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Are senators ready for the question? Oh, Senator Whetstone. Senator Whetstone on debate.
Yes, Speaker, thank you. I just felt it important to rise on this most recent issue, as I will be speaking on the matter of beneficial ownership that has been discussed. I feel like we're in pre-study of my discussion of the beneficial ownership, which is forthcoming. But what I simply wanted to point out is recognizing this amendment that under Canadian securities laws, as I think discussed by Senator Dean, that it's really under the CSA, Canadian Securities Administrators, that have what is known as a early warning requirement under securities laws, so that any security holder that advances their interest in a public corporation, this applies to all 13 securities regulators across Canada, it's a CSA requirement, must disclose publicly the ownership of those particular shares or other securities. Many companies or shareholders reach the point of 9.9% and don't go over it because they don't want to have it disclosed publicly. When they hit the 10% mark, it must be disclosed. It applies to all public companies in whatever area of activity they're engaged in. They go above, there are 2% increments. If you reach 20%, then the takeover bid rules apply, which is also further public disclosure to all shareholders of the corporation. So rather than my speaking directly to the amendment, which probably I should, obviously I have some sympathy to any matter of transparency regarding beneficial ownership, whether it be with marijuana companies or other companies, which will obviously address issues of money laundering, organized crime, real estate investment, etc. So I simply want to point out to my colleagues here in the Senate that this 10% early warning requirement is for all public companies and must be disclosed publicly. Thank you, Speaker.
Are senators ready for the question? It was moved by the Honourable Senator Carignan, seconded by the Honourable Senator Andrechuk, that Bill C-45 be not now read a third time, but that it be amended in Clause 62. May I dispense? It's your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion. All those in favour of the motion will please say yea. Yea. All those opposed, nay. Nay. My opinion, the yeas have it.